like 3 pairs of sweatpants and 2 pairs of silk pajama pants.
All right, before we talk about our clothes, Kate,
what?
we have to announce the episode because we are now live.
Hi.
It is 5 o'clock, April 7th, 2020. The coronavirus is rampaging across the world. Boris Johnson is still in the hospital. What other terrible things are going on?
The Wisconsin election is still happening, but
is melted down.
No one who has lupus can actually get treated for it because everyone has this crazy run on chloroquine.
I am actively baking biscuits. Sorry, I just thought we were talking about what's going on right now.
No such thing as fun anymore, but in lieu of fun, we are here. Kate Klonick and I don't even know how to describe Alan Rozenshtein anymore. My good friend,
Mensch.
Yes.
The first ever Lawfare student contributor, the only person who has called me an asshole in the first time we ever met in a position of like subordinate to me, for which I have so much respect. And a professor at the University of Minnesota, author of all kinds of cool things, and critically, husband of Hannah Neprash, who was supposed to be with us on this show, but has gotten called into a different call. So Hannah, who is a healthcare economist, will join us on a different episode.
We should have an economist show, Ben.
It's true.
We're overdue.
Yeah, exactly. There have not been enough economists on the show. So, Alan, we're here to talk about all things surveillance and COVID-19. But first, tell us about what you're drinking and how you are spending your time while you are in isolation.
So I am drinking a rum old fashioned. This is a maple rum old fashioned because I'm too lazy to make simple syrup, and this is the most available.
Sweet.
It's it's not a lot of maple syrup, and it's pretty decent rum, so which is actually not too sweet. So it's pretty good. Nice. Yeah, no, rum is great. I got into it because whiskey was too expensive, and rum cost half as much. And now I just like it.
You literally sound like a bootlegger or a pirate.
I'll take either. I'll take either.
Maybe they're the same thing.
People don't appreciate that rum is actually even more American than whiskey because rum came first, right? Rum.
Yeah, but rum is, let's be serious here.
Yeah,
rum
I was just going to say, isn't that like the straight up triangle trade?
Yeah, exactly.
Directly to slavery.
We've got some.
There's some hardships with that comparison.
Yes, that is a fair point, and I am now
some baggage that whiskey doesn't have.
I am now remembering that line from the musical 1776 about rum and something and slaves.
Sit down, John. No.
Yes.
Different line.
Sit down, Thomas. Right? It wasn't he yelling at Thomas Jefferson. Anyway, it's delicious. So that's what I'm drinking. And what am I doing? I'm teaching. School is still in session, though we're doing everything remotely, which is an interesting experience, trying to teach a 100-student law course on Zoom, but it's surprisingly effective. I am finally finishing Middlemarch, which is a project I've had on and off for the last 7 years or so. So I'm really, really excited.
Oh my God. Sorry, Ben. I have to say something for a second. I was supposed to read that book twice in college. Like I took a class called Middlemarch and the Sopranos, which was literally a comparison between Middlemarch and I went to Brown. Okay. And so this was like, but there was this kind of, like arch and like, I don't know. I never actually finished the book, but it is quite good once you get into it.
I didn't appreciate it's one of the funnier books
really
I've actually.
Okay, so
it's like the Tom. Honestly, it's the best comparison I can make for someone, and you have to sort of get into the language. Obviously, it's a different social setting and stuff like that. But once you get into the language, it honestly reminds me more than anything of Tom Wolfe's Bonfire of the Vanities.
Okay, wait a minute. This is the second time you have referred to this book as funny.
It's really funny.
It is really actually quite funny. Just like Pride and Prejudice is funny. But
I have not read this book since college. I did read the whole thing in college, and what I remember about it is that it is about an ambitious, highly creative woman who marries who is very excited to marry a young man who seems to value and respect her, and they get married, and he turns out to be a monster who wants to keep her in a box. And I remember being horrified by it from the moment I realized what the book was about through the end. I just don't remember mirth as being any more a part of that book than it is about the House of Mirth.
So I feel like you're describing
funny too.
I feel like you're describing like the Bronte version of Middlemarch.
Yes.
It's
not. It's
not.
actually like, you have to think about it. That's why it was compared to The Sopranos, because it was about like, it was episodic and how it came out. It didn't actually get published as that giant tome that it is now. It got published in regular installments. I forget the magazine that it was published in, but like, anyways, you have to think about it as like a serial drama comedy.
Well, I'm going to reread it.
Also, Moby Dick is really funny.
Yeah, well, Moby Dick is wonderful, but
I don't know. It's a lot of whale facts that I don't really need. I can't get over like the
I'm
whale
really
facts.
into the.
I love the whale facts.
Yeah. But I'm going to reread Middlemarch with an eye toward finding the funny parts, and maybe I'll send them to you, Alan.
Wow, that'll be the real in lieu of fun.
I'm on the receiving end of Wittes's book report.
Yeah, like, oh, it's really funny. On page 312 when she's completely miserable and sobbing her.
Things can be funny and dramatic. It's a dark comedy, right? But you should read it, because I think you will be. And I think so. How old were you when you read it the first time?
Probably 21.
Yeah. So I think especially if you read it when you're 21 and you identify as is quite reasonably to do so with Dorothea's character. I think if you read it when you're older, you kind of realize that they're all kind of ding-dongs. Even the good ones are kind of ding-dongs. And so I think it's just a lot easier to laugh at them. Although it's also sad in places. I will own that.
I'm just giving everyone a fair warning. I wasn't joking about actively cooking biscuits. I made sourdough biscuits and they're in my oven right now. It smells amazing in here. You're very jealous. But I have to, the buzzer's going to go off in a second. So just FYI.
Okay. When the buzzer goes off, we will dismiss you for a moment.
Okay.
And you can take care. I want people to be able to see the coronavirus-free lap dances background here.
Yeah, where is that from, though?
It was sent me by a friend in Las Vegas.
Oh, where else could it possibly be from, Kate?
That's a great.
Why
or
Atlantic City.
Well,
or something.
I was just going to say New Jersey is the other place it could be from.
So here is my very nerdy question to Ben that I asked him before we started rolling, which is that a hyphen or an N dash? Because that actually makes a big difference. Is it a virus-free lap dance?
No one cares.
No, I think it is meant to say, I think coronavirus is meant to be one word. It's meant to be a hyphen, so it's virus-free lap dances.
I'm going to take your background and I'm just going to take out coronavirus and put in free lap dances.
Yeah, well, I think that's what
I was going to Photoshop it.
Whether it's the lap dances that are free or the lap dances that are free of coronavirus.
I think the lap dances, they have to be lap-free lap dances, I think, to be free of coronavirus. I'm just saying, look, I want, this is guys, this is part of the economic and social life of our nation that at some point needs to restart, right?
Truly.
You're absolutely right. The lap dancing industry has been really hurt by the coronavirus.
I was actually thinking about this because after Danielle was on like last week, I was thinking about this because I was thinking about Sesta Fosta and like all of the ways that like that hurt 230 people were against 230 reform on Sesta Fosta that were active in the sex worker industry, which then kind of spurred me. I'm like, oh wow, the sex worker industry. I wonder what's happening with that right now. Like, who the hell is going to be going to visit? Like, and like, I mean, it's kind of a gig economy.
Yeah, I don't know, but I got to assume they don't get unemployment insurance, right? I mean, it's a big problem.
Obviously not. And I mean, like, I was actually kind of,
tips.
I'm actually kind of not joking. I was like, oh yeah, that's like a marginal on the margins, like type of like personal service that is like is just going to disappear.
Well, and the much, there's various iterations of it, right? There's the street version, which must be entirely dried up since so few people are walking around in urban areas. But there's also I actually wonder if there's a pretty substantial illicit call girl trade going on, because a lot of people who can't go out are ordering in, basically.
Oh yeah, no, totally. No, that's exactly. And like sex clubs or like or stripper clubs or anything like this, like I don't know, it's like you kind of scale it out and you realize how interconnected the economy is and how it's like water through like a water wheel. And it's just kind of like if it's not like if everything, it touches everything and it's constantly keeping everything going. And if it stops for one person, like my parents, I don't know, all of you are probably, my parents are like, it's great. We're eating in more and cooking for ourselves. And it's great. We're saving lots of money. And I was like, you're saving money because you're not spending money, which means the restaurants are going out of business. Servers don't have any type of income, and you're not going to have a culture to come back to based around like in-person restaurants. And like the basic economic truth of that is, I just don't think anyone's ever felt it as deeply as this. Like,
yeah, I think part of what's hard to grasp and I think sort of what's interesting, right, is that the modern economy, and I'm not an economist at all, so I'm just thinking about this as a layperson.
But you're married to one.
But I am. Don't I know it? But I'm married to one. No, just how momentum driven everything is, right? Which is to say, it's not. I kind of my naive view of the economy, right, is that you have someone doing something here and someone doing something there and someone doing something there, and that can stop for a while and then it can restart. But in fact, it only works because everything is just in time, right? Like I get a paycheck, and so then I go to the restaurant, and then the cook goes to the grocery store, and then like at some point you get to a strip club, and then that person has to go like buy a hammer at the hardware store, right? And the moment that stuff stops, it can't just stop for a moment and then gracefully restart, right? It has to then all restart in the same way or in the right order. And yes, that is kind of a terrifying thought for when
the inefficiencies of the market are being laid bare, like the waste, for example. Like, so it's really interesting. So I've heard sorry, that's my biscuits. I've heard in New York that like basically basically what's happening is that all restaurants are requesting 3 to 4 hours, like by 5 o'clock or like 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock, takeout orders. And then they won't fill orders after 5 o'clock. So you place your order by 5, and that's to allow them to also scale the amount of sourced goods that they're buying in order to fulfill those orders for the next week or for the next day. And that's like a much tighter and much more, I mean, restaurants, especially in New York, which always are working at a thin margin, are very good at making do with like, or reusing things or recycling things. But like, it's kind of amazing. I think maybe we'll come out as a leaner economy. I don't know, but in a long time.
Oh yeah, no, I'm sure. I mean, I have no doubt. Like it's interesting, right? I mean, you think of something like the Black Death, right? Which for obvious reasons, this is not, unfortunately, right? But there's, a lot of historians think, or maybe this is the kind of standard historical view, right? That the Black Death was the main thing that actually drove economic and scientific progress in Europe, because it killed a third of the people or half the people, and suddenly there were no laborers. And so all of these, the people who acted as capitalists at the time, the landowners, had to invest in all this labor-saving equipment and science and machinery and stuff like that. And so what you ended up with is a much more advanced economy when it recovered, which of course is cold comfort to like half of Europe that died, right? So yes, I'm sure there will be in certain senses economies and efficiencies to be extracted from this, but still doesn't.
This is like Ben's. This is Ben. There's the upside of the Black Death.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
For your plagues piece.
When I am lying with a intubated, gasping for air, my last thought will be what comfort I can take in the efficiencies of the economy that I am contributing to.
You know, you can just, what you really should think to drive it home, you can think of what are the inefficiencies I've brought to Lawfare and how better will it be in my absence? I think that's what you should, right. That's how you should console yourself on your deathbed.
Kate, you should get your biscuits.
I did.
You did?
Kind of. Well, they need a little more time, so they're just gonna hang out.
All right. So everybody who's watching, if you want to get in on the conversation, you know the drill. Put a question in the Q&A. Do not just raise your hand, because then we will assume you're a Zoom troll and we will dismiss you with a shocking lack of due process. But write your question. We will bring you on to pose it. And Alan, let's talk about surveillance and COVID-19. Oren Kerr was on the other day and suggested that surveillance may be a civil liberties plus in this environment, to the extent it lets us get back out in the world a little bit. Public
I thought
health.
that was such an interesting point.
So let's start with that. What do you think?
Yeah,
Should we all embrace surveillance as the way out here?
I mean, if it works, right? I think we should probably have more surveillance than we currently have. I mean, the problem is we're making, we're making decisions based on imperfect information, and so it's very easy to look at whatever piece of evidence you want to look at to support your particular view. I mean, the reason that I've been exploring this question of is surveillance or part of the answer for getting out of this faster, and I think Oren's totally right. This is not a liberty, security, or privacy, security trade-off, as is usually framed with these issues. It's just a straight up liberty trade-off, because I would love to leave my house and I am not at liberty to do so.
The interesting thing about what's conscribing your liberty is both like government instruction, which I would actually say is like, to my legal realist mind, is like the least constricting part of like the liberty, like, and the realist norm-based liberty, reality-based liberty, which is just like, no one wants to get this disease and they don't want to leave their house, so they don't want to get this disease. I just want to like spell that out. It's like two different things. Like, it's not like China ordering us to stay home is the reason we're actually, or our government asking us to stay home is the reason that we all are like agreeing to stay home. We also see that there is some like social norm and like reason for this to be occurring.
Well, yeah. So I wanted to jump on the social norm thing, right? So we have an official. I'm in Minnesota, and we have an official order not to. To be honest, I'm not actually even sure what the official Minnesota order says. And I think that's just a testament to the fact that a large part of why a lot of people are staying home, and I think especially true for younger people who potentially have less of a risk of contracting the disease themselves, or if they do get it, of having a really bad outcome, is just I don't want to get the stink eye from everyone else as I'm traipsing around the town. So I think a lot of what's actually keeping people indoors is good old fashioned shame and fear of social judgment, which is excellent. So I mean, for me, the big piece of evidence is South Korea and Taiwan and Singapore, and it's just looking how East Asian countries have dealt with this problem. And again, right, it's hard to compare. There's so many variables. They're different countries. They are smaller. They went through SARS and MERS in the last 15 years, so they generally have their act together more than we have, et cetera, et cetera. But nevertheless, it does seem like a big part of why they've been able to avoid total lockdown is because they are doing really, really, really quite invasive invasive surveillance. And you know, when people have been talking about the East Asian examples, there's like a whiff of this sort of like, well, you know, East Asian cultures, they're much more Confucian, they're much more hierarchical, et cetera, et cetera. I'm just not actually convinced of any of that. I think that they're just, frankly, 10 years or 5 years, or at this point, 2 months ahead of where we are, right? Where they've realized that they value their freedoms just as much as the next liberal democracy does, but they've decided that this is worth doing. And so I don't know. I just especially when I think of this as compared to 9/11, which obviously was a huge loss and a huge threat. Still nothing like this in terms of both lives lost and economic dislocation. I just don't see a world in which we don't very seriously consider a gigantic surveillance apparatus coming out of this. And there are good ways and bad ways of doing it, obviously.
All right, so we're going to get to that, but we have a question first from John Bordeaux, faithful viewer. John, what's on your mind?
I guess my question, we've always talked about the right to privacy, and I do like the way you framed it. We've always had the privacy liberty debate. But I sense now that privacy has become weaponized. So if I want to be able to walk around without being surveilled, without you knowing my health status, that now is a threat to you. So have I lost my right to privacy because now my health situation is a public concern?
I mean, it's a good question. We've never had, so there is no such thing as a universal right to privacy in American, certainly not in American legal culture. There are various little pockets where you get rights to privacy. So there's like rights to privacy and not being harassed, or there are other kinds of rights to privacy, the rights to privacy in the criminal context. But there's no general right to privacy, because if there was, then basically the modern administrative state circa, 1930s and beyond wouldn't exist, if only because the modern state requires just massive amounts of tracking and surveillance and some such. We just don't tend to call it surveillance. I think this is a point you, Ben, made really well in this book you wrote with Gabby Bloom a couple years back, right, where you guys pointed out that we do surveillance all the time. It's just that when we're okay with it, we don't call it surveillance. We call it monitoring, or right, I don't know what we call it.
In the public health arena. So look, we do surveillance when the cops surveil the streets, right? We like that surveillance. We say we want more cops on the streets, and we call it community-oriented policing. What are they doing? They're standing on street corners watching what happens. It's surveillance of public spaces, right? When we don't call what you do at an airport surveillance, even though they're literally body scanning you and going through your bags. They call it screening, right? And so we have all these euphemistic words for surveillance that we like. The one community that is totally honest about surveillance and that uses surveillance in a positive context, ironically, is the public health community. And so you'll always hear infectious disease people saying things like, oh, we need more surveillance on malaria in this country. And what they mean is testing and, sort of awareness of the spread of things. But it's a series of linguistic games that we play to avoid acknowledging that actually we do all kinds of surveillance all the time.
And I will say, I think part of what makes me more confident in thinking that one of the results of this will be a vastly expanded surveillance structure is precisely that public health people are already comfortable with the idea of surveillance. Now, they're not necessarily comfortable with like national security surveillance or criminal law surveillance, or the sort of surveillance that like we tend to think about, right? But they are comfortable with the idea of surveillance. So when someone tells them, we don't want a surveillance state, or surveillance is the road to dictatorship, I think their response quite reasonably is, no, it's more the road to controlling malaria or whatnot. Now, in terms of whether privacy has been weaponized, I think sometimes it certainly is, right? I think that there are really two The people that push back against surveillance, I think you can often kind of roughly group them into two different buckets. Right? One bucket are libertarians who just, I think of sort of like the Ron Swanson from Parks and Rec kind of person who is just horrified at the idea that anyone knows anything about them. And they have this kind of emotional revulsion. They really feel it is an invasion for the government to know information about them. I don't personally share that view, and I don't think there's actually a ton of like mutual ground in which to argue with folks like that, right? If you're just against surveillance ideologically, I think that, I think you're going to become much less relevant, frankly, in the next several years of policy debates. So that's kind of one group. The other group of people are people who are basically just kind of technocrats who think, yeah, of course we need surveillance, but if you look at the history of surveillance in this country, it's often really wasteful, it's ineffective, it's used to target minorities, there's mission creep, there's all of this sort of stuff. And so we have to tread very, very carefully. And I think it's important to very clearly differentiate between the more kind of ideological arguments against surveillance, which I don't think there's a lot to say, and then the more technocratic arguments to limit surveillance, which I think are great. And I consider myself one of those people that thinks about that sort of stuff.
I am interested that you split this between libertarians and technocrats. That's not where I would put it, but yeah, sure.
Where would you put it?
I would kind of put it between American and European. And I would put Americans in two different camps, which are maybe aligned with what you just described. But then I would describe the idea of privacy as a dignitary right that the US Constitution doesn't recognize, as you said, but that the UN Constitution, the UN Charter and most of the EU basically does recognize. And so there's kind of this, I'm just kind of interested in this idea that I do agree though in bulk with Ben's point in particular, which is that we call all of this something else and it ends up being the same thing. So I call it content moderation, which it is some of the time, but it is also sometimes, frankly, censorship. And I would yes, exactly. And it's the same thing with surveillance, exactly the same thing. I think the distinction really for me lies in scale.
The content moderation is also surveillance, by the way.
Yes, no, it totally is. And I was just kind of thinking as Alan was talking, and I was what if we lived in a world in which going forward, I was actually tending to my biscuits and listening. And I was maybe I should bring my biscuits.
How bucolic. This is this pastoral scene of biscuits and
I really have a lot of dirt under my nails, even though I've been washing my hands obsessively. But I mean, it's good, clean dirt. Dirt don't hurt. But there is but I mean, my point is basically I was trying to say that there is how much am I willing to share about my life, in every day, in a YouTube live streaming thing. That I know some of my students watch, and I know my faculty watches, and I know colleagues watch. And so, and my parents would be horrified. So there is all of these notions of privacy that are, as we talked about, based on social norms that are rapidly changing, not going to your grocery store without a mask. And then other ones like how you share information, which seem outdated, or generationally bound. Does that make sense?
It does. Can I just say one not important thing and then one real thing? So the not important thing, though it's important to me, it's really hard to go to the grocery store with the mask on. I want to say that. I'm a big fan of the produce section. I go there and I smell the oranges and it's like a Zen thing for me.
I
it's really
hated
hard.
People like you before this.
Who
the hell is smelling oranges?
It's like my communing with nature. But it's really hard to do that through a mask. So it's interesting that you would bring Europe into this. So I think this is a common view that there's this big European-US divide, right? And that Europe takes privacy really seriously. They think of it as part of dignity and autonomy, and the US kind of doesn't. And I don't think that's right, actually. And I think that the EU and certain bureaucrats and policymakers in the EU think of privacy this way. But I think that actually the EU member states, which as we're seeing now are so much more important when it comes to policy and actually doing things in the EU, are vastly less concerned with privacy than the United States is, right? And when you look at the levels of, this is kind of the big, so I used to work in the Department of Justice, in the National Security Division, and I spent a lot of time working on these kind of US EU issues, and we'd have these. It was really funny because you talk to the EU people and they'd go on and on about how their conceptions of privacy were so much better than America's, and we listen politely, and then they'd leave, and whatever it is, what it is. And then we turn to like the representative from some European Union nation, and we'd say, you can't possibly believe in this, because if you did, like none of this relationship would work. And they would say, oh yeah, don't worry about the EU. No one actually listens to them. And so I think there's this giant disconnect between what the kind of intellectuals in Europe say and what the actual governments in Europe do. And they are so much less concerned about privacy than the United States. They don't have anything like FISA.
There's also a huge disconnect between the justice ministries of the member state countries and the interior ministries of the member state countries. That you have these kind of multiple personalities of toward privacy of the intelligence agencies of the countries and the interior ministries on the one hand, which are all about data sharing and getting information, and the data protection authorities and the justice ministries, which are all, really interested in articulating high-minded principles.
Yeah.
I mean, like, I kind of feel like, there's this, that's actually a great point. I almost feel like Europe figured out sooner, well, had the opportunity to figure out sooner because they rewrote their entire constitution, like in 100 years ago, basically, figured out how to do this better than America does it, which is basically to say, like, just show them the rights, like, and codify the rights, perform the rights, perform the idea of the rights in the official founding documents, and then just do whatever the hell you want after that.
And I think to kind of, and maybe to kind of give them even more credit, I think the other thing that they've done, which is really helpful, and I think what we are going to see actually in America, because there's no other way of doing it, is to say, look, everyone has a right to privacy, because obviously it's an important right. And there are tons and tons of things the government does that implicate that right to privacy, right? Obviously, like breaking your house down to search it implicates privacy, but so does collecting information for the census. So does doing contact tracing for coronavirus. Almost anything you can think of implicates privacy, but that's fine. The court's job is not, the court's job is not to say, did this implicate a fundamental right? If so, the government can't do it. It's to say, most things implicate fundamental rights. No big deal. We have a mechanism for figuring out if that's okay. And it's called proportionality, right? What is how much of the right did you infringe upon? Was there a good reason to do so? Was there a better way you could have done so that you didn't do? And you just,
I used to think that this was such an onerous and like bullshit burden. And now I have found myself really grateful for it. Honestly.
Right. I want to sketch out a zero privacy impact surveillance scheme for coronavirus and have you both tell me why it's a problem. So what I'm about to describe is loosely based on an article that Stuart Baker wrote on Lawfare, ironically in praise of an app developed by the Singaporeans. So with due respect for its somewhat disreputable origin and the baggage that it, like rum, carries, I think there's a lot.
What do you have against Singapore? Or is this a dig on Stuart Baker?
No. It's a dig on Singapore, which is an authoritarian monstrosity.
With really good chili crab.
Yeah, no, it's got uncommonly good food. I have enjoyed every moment I've ever spent in Singapore, and the government is a real horrible thing. Okay, but here's the here's the way the app works. First of all, let's say it were developed by Apple. So it's not developed by the government. You can download it if you want to. So it is purely voluntary. And what it does is if I choose to download it and you guys choose to download it, then whenever our phones are in close proximity to one another for a protracted period of time, say 15 minutes, time for one of us to really cough on the other, the two phones log that they have been in contact with one another. Now, if I am then diagnosed with coronavirus, I may, but wouldn't necessarily have to, turn over my phone to public health authorities for the limited purpose of examining these logs so that they could warn the people I have been in close proximity to that they have been exposed to somebody who has been exposed to coronavirus, and then they can get tested. And so my question is, if the app is effective, that is, it works, and the downloading of it is purely voluntary, you would do it, say, to protect yourself and to allow to protect those that you care about and might be in contact with. And if the subsequent disclosure of the information is also voluntary, why does this pose any privacy threat at all?
So there's like a legal question, and then there's a more privacy question. So there's
no,
like
and I'm not asking. The legal question is, it's you want to download it, they want to produce it.
Yeah,
you do that. That's easy. But I'm talking about the, like, my question is there even a normative privacy problem here if it's all voluntary?
Well, you're using voluntary in a way that sorry, and Alan, tell me if I'm wrong, but you're using voluntary in a way that like basically thinks that privacy is completely like conscribed by a concept of consent. And like most empirical studies and most, I would say like some really great empirical studies recently show that like people can't knowledgeably consent to privacy, even when like to giving away their privacy concerns, even in certain contexts like COVID or like a doctor's office or like whatever. People have no ability to like really understand exactly what their or I shouldn't say that, no ability. People don't typically understand exactly what they're giving away when they give away those rights. And so I think that that's kind of the thing that like it hinges on. But Alan, go ahead.
So yeah, one argument is that you can't kind of informatively consent away your privacy. Another argument is that your disclosure, even your voluntary, let's say you could, right, consent, even your voluntary disclosure of data to the government or to some third party has these spillover effects on other people, because it allows the government, let's say, not just to figure out that you have coronavirus because you told them, but to figure out that people in your house might have coronavirus or people on your street might have coronavirus. And that then allows them to take actions that may harm those people. Now, to be clear, I don't find, look, you asked, are there privacy concerns? I don't think that there are privacy concerns that are like particularly troubling to me. But yes, if you were to bring like a hardcore like privacy advocate / theorist, I think they could spin out a ton of speculative and not so speculative privacy concerns, right? I mean, like, they're just people, if you think that the government cannot be trusted with intimate information about you because they're incompetent or they're malevolent or they're both, right? Then yeah, all of this has privacy impacts, which is, I think, why looking for the magical zero privacy cost solution is kind of pointless.
Or can we also just talk about the fact that like giving up your privacy to a private corporation for the coronavirus period versus giving it up to the government for the coronavirus period, it is unclear how either of those parties are communicating with each other about about like your private data or anything. And it's unclear whether those, at which point, like those types of coronavirus emergency like like examples, like the people kind of expect out of like these types of moments are going to be lifted by either party. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying it couldn't have privacy impact. I'm just saying it would be when anybody downloaded the thing, they would be understanding, first of all, that they're participating in this mass surveillance project, that they get some benefit from it, i.e., that if they're the benefit, the immediate personal benefit that I get is possibility of being notified if people I'm in contact with are testing positive. Also, the possibility of having people I care about notified if I'm diagnosed, and so I'm getting some immediate benefit from it. I'm also giving away a certain amount of information, both about myself and about the people that I'm in contact with, all of whom would have also agreed to this as part of downloading the app in the first place. So my point isn't that it has no privacy impact. My point is that it's not like the government saying, okay, we're going to collect from phone companies the metadata associated with every phone call, which is something I never agreed to. And in fact, I don't even know it's happening. It's not even like a search warrant being executed, which they've met a certain threshold of evidence, but nobody asked me if they could access my, my Google chat or my YouPorn history. This is something that I very self-consciously agreed to do, not as part of a click-through agreement, but I agreed to participate in a mass surveillance program, both as a matter of public good and as a matter of my own good. It seems really straightforward to me.
I mean, I think it is pretty straightforward, and that specific situation, and it's not just Singapore that's doing this. So Singapore made this app open source, but there's like an MIT version that people are working on. I think Oxford's working on it. There are all sorts of outfits in America and in other countries that have impeccable privacy bona fides and are run by seriously privacy minded technologist types who are coming up with this stuff. So I think that's probably fine. I think one question to ask though is, and this is why I'm a little skeptical of these apps, not that they're not part of the solution at all. They sound like they could be really useful, but because let's say that some fraction of the population downloaded and started using these apps, right? And therefore we had a bending of the curve somewhat, right? I don't know what it is, right? Well, that would, I think, make really vivid that this kind of surveillance is incredibly effective, right? And so then the question,
effective in what way?
Well, let's say we're effective. Let's say these apps actually helped flatten the curve, decrease mortality, right? I'm not an epidemiologist, so I don't even know what we're trying to accomplish exactly, but made things
that's kind of my
somehow.
point, which is like surveillance apps are effective, but that is the thing, is that the effectiveness in which people agree and give their consent to download the apps and use them, the effectiveness of them is fine in the limited nature that they understand what it is that they're like using these types of new technology. And then when that changes, they continue, like they drag the consent along.
Yeah,
does that make sense?
Yeah, so that's interesting. So that's a different argument than I was going to make. So the argument you're making, it sounds like, is look, let's say these apps are really effective at whatever they're trying to do. Well, 2 months from now, what's going to happen to all that data? What's going to happen to these apps? Right. Exactly. So that's one question. Totally fair question.
That's part one of my question. The second part is more interesting.
Okay, so part one of my answer, and then we can get to part two, or like sub one or something, is let's say that some substantial fraction of the population downloaded these apps and therefore they had some beneficial effect. Wouldn't the response be from the general public or the government be, wow, this is really effective, right? This kind of surveillance really works. Why are we allowing people to choose into this or not, right? Like, we don't allow people whether or not to get their boilers inspected, right? Because when they blow up, that's a big problem, right? Or whatever, any other of the million health and safety things we do in this country, right? So to me, I'm skeptical that these apps, unless they were 100% effective, which I don't think anyone is claiming that they would be, would not essentially just lead the way to government mandates, which again, I personally am probably okay with. But this is to answer Ben's point of what are the privacy harms. So there's like a second order thing going on, I think.
All right, so question. If this app were available now from a source you trusted, i.e. not the government of Singapore, but I don't know, Apple Computer or the MIT Privacy Lab, or, you know, take your pick, would you download it?
It's a serious question. I probably would. I think that, and I wonder if people working on these apps are thinking about this. I think really key to an app like this is to guilt people into using it. And the best way of doing that is to allow people to publicly broadcast that they're using this app, right? So like there should be some way, whether it's on social media or in your email signature, to prove that you are in fact using this app. And I don't know exactly what it would be, right? You'd embed some like bit of HTML code and it would show a smiley face or something if you are a registered user in good standing. Because I think this is a sort of thing that there's an instinct of this is creepy, which I think is a fair instinct. And for it to work, it needs to be counterbalanced by the instinct of everyone is doing this. And if I don't do it, I'm going to be that jerk.
I'm a creep and I'm proud of it. Would you download it, Kate?
Yeah, I actually am really I think that like I think that we are really, I think that what you just said about like we have a leaning towards thinking like this is creepy. And so we're not going to do this, or we judge people for doing it. I actually think that that's, I think what's happening in that moment is people are updating their priors about what they're putting out into the world and they're uncomfortable with it. Like that's basically like, I think that like when you have in the privacy context, people that you confront them with, okay, we're going like, did you know that so I experienced this. I wrote this thread 2 years ago. It was 2 years ago. No, it was last year. It was a thread on Twitter that was about basically an assignment that I gave to my information privacy students. That was like, I have 7 of them. And I was basically like, okay, it's spring break. When you're off traveling, I don't want you to ever purposefully eavesdrop on any conversation that is obviously meant to be private. And I do not want you to do anything creepy or record this in any way. But I want to see if you can de-anonymize a person in public that just based on like the things that they're loudly saying on their phone or otherwise in other contexts. And based on like their clothing or their like monograms on their luggage or like whatever else. And people were like, I got like this ended up getting written up, and I wrote an op-ed for the New York Times. And then I wrote, it was in the NPR, and people freaked out. And like, everyone was like, the creepy assignment. And I was like, is it creepy? Or am I like doing you a service by telling you that you're going around shedding this information all the time without even realizing it for people to take up? And like, if you don't think that there are people that do this, there are totally people that do this, and you should be aware of that. And there's this, I mean, this is like Woody Hartzog's work on like privacy by obscurity. This is all this kind of stuff. Like, I just think that it like kind of all blends together at a certain point, which is like people need to change how they think about privacy and what their reasonable expectations are for how private everything is.
Yeah, so I have 2 stories about this. One of the people who does this sort of thing, you know, professionally is a woman named Ashley Feinberg. And she works for Slate now. She used to work for Gawker, or I forget which. And she's principally, she recently outed Mitt Romney's secret Twitter feed.
Oh yeah.
The Pierre Delecto feed, but one of her first big coups in this department was outing Jim Comey's Twitter feed while he was while he was still FBI director. And one of the key pieces of information that she used in doing that was me. That is that feed followed me and I was one of the very small number of people that had followed. a lesser known Ashley Feinberg piece. She spoofed my email by way of trying to get Comey to give her a password to something.
Oh my
And
God.
she sent him an email
That
disguised.
feels like a 1030 violation.
Are
Well,
you
except
kidding
there in tiny letters at the bottom, it said, "This is not really Ben Wittes. It's really, Ashley." I mean, it's super sleazy. She did escape a 1030 prosecution. But yeah, there are people who do this.
Sounds
And,
like wire fraud, my friend.
I'm sure she was acting on advice of counsel. And when I have confronted her in public about identity theft, she has been very defensive and calls it undercover journalism. As the person whose identity was stolen for this purpose, I have always taken
You're
it.
less sympathetic.
I'm a little less sympathetic. Notably, as the story reflects, Jim did not fall for it. He sent me an email saying, "Is this you?" And I said no, and that was the end of it. So that's story number one. Story number two is that shortly after this happened, one of my student contributors engaged in a much less ethically problematic stalking attempt at, let's just say, a person of extraordinary prominence. And the person wrote up very elegantly how he had identified this person's Twitter feed and asked if I would publish it. And I, along with another person, the person had ethical qualms about what he had done, actually, and didn't know whether publishing it was the right thing. And partly because of my experience with Ashley Feinberg and Jim Comey, I don't want Lawfare to be in that business. I was completely convinced this was the person. And so I actually advised this person to turn the article into a memo to the individual about how your anonymity is a lot less safe than you think it is. And that Twitter feed has never been outed. I don't think it still exists. And I think that person was extremely grateful to not have had that story, which, by the way, I think had no real public interest. It was like the Jim Comey Twitter feed, just outing somebody to show that you can do it. And I have always felt very good about, like, that person has a little more privacy because that kid decided to share the information as a memo to the individual rather than to out the person.
Did you ever hear how that memo was received?
Yes.
Not well?
Oh, no, it was received very well.
It was
and
like
it was
they were
deeply,
thankful.
it was deeply appreciated, and it was and received with appropriate gratitude, humility, and good humor.
Kate, it did occur to me. So it's funny. So when you described your assignment, my first thought was, that's a creepy assignment. And that's a really cool assignment, and that's a really good assignment, and it's also a creepy assignment. But then it occurs to me that, like, anyone who's done any online dating in the last 7 years,
I mean, that's all you're doing.
That's like all you do,
Alan.
basically.
That
and
is exactly my point.
Anyone who denies that they do that is lying.
Yes. No, everyone does this about everything. And my point was, we carry these tools to do this around in our pocket on these tiny computers with this massive search engine and all of these abilities all the time. And people are constantly shedding information and not aware of how much. I mean, like, literally, there were two, I would say there were two different types of information that my students collected. One was literally sitting in a Starbucks listening to someone read their credit card birth date, expiration date, social security number over the phone in Denver. Okay. And so, like, they were like, I don't think I would have noticed unless you had told me to be, like, aware of, like, my surroundings. And I'm like, like that's all it takes is like one person who is aware in a setting to pick up these types of things. And then the second thing was more to like the point which I was trying to describe, which is that like if you have your Letterman's jacket on that has your name on it and you say an identifying thing about you on the subway about like what town you're from or whatever else, people can find you like that. Like they can de-anonymize you in 5 seconds. And I think that it's like I think that we're idiots if we think that it's just people who are on dating apps or people who are looking for jobs and like researching their employers or their potential employees or whatever by Googling. Like, no, we all do that. And that was kind of my point is like, this is just a bomb waiting to go off.
So I am curious. Do you guys think that one of the kind of out of the aftermath of all of this, we will set up a South Korea style disease surveillance regime? And so like, just to be more concrete, like right now, there is no good law that fits this fact pattern, right? So we have, national security surveillance law, which doesn't really fit. We have criminal surveillance laws, the Stored Communications Act, which like you can sort of use in bits and pieces if you wanted to do this stuff, but it doesn't really work properly. And then we have a bunch of really vague open-ended authorities, right? So you have all like the public health authorities and the emergency authorities, which I think you could actually make an argument would authorize the creation of this kind of surveillance, right? But no one likes that because of course that's really vague and stuff like that. So, if this is going to be fixed, right, doesn't Congress have to pass a law basically like the disease stored communications, like the Infectious Disease Stored Communications Act equivalent?
Ben, you answer first because I know that mine's going to be crazy.
So you're assuming, I think, that the things you would want to access are communications, and I'm not sure that's right. I think
no, you mostly want location data.
Exactly. So it's I think to say disease stored communications act is probably a little bit misleading.
Yeah.
But look,
sure.
There's another problem that you didn't mention, which is that to the extent that there are the kind of granular authorities you're talking about, except with respect to interstate matters or the borders, they tend to reside in the state police power, not in the federal government. So if you're thinking about creating a like FISA of the disease world or a Stored Communications Act, A, it's got to be national. B, it's got to be public health based. And C, it has to get down to the layer of individuals, of regulating the conduct of individuals, which we don't normally think of the federal government as doing, except in the criminal context.
But I was going to say, so this is perfect, because what I was going to say was like, you can do this and it would pass constitutional muster, maybe if it was state by state. Like maybe if each state created its own created its own standards and like had its own, I think that like if you had a federal registry across, why do you Ben, why do you think that a national registry would be beneficial versus a state registry?
Well, so as I understand the South Korean law, and I have read exactly one detailed article about it, it's basically a public health law that is triggered by the presence of a dangerous communicable disease. And it allows isolation and surveillance in connection with the management of that disease. But it's a very specific targeted set of authorities, and it grew out of the MERS epidemic and the South Korean failure to do that. Now, I have no doubt that you could pass a federal law like that and it would be constitutional. I do wonder if in a country this size, realistically, you would have the federal manpower located in the CDC, right? Which
that's kind of, maybe that's what I'm talking about, which
doesn't really have detention authority, right? So I think you'd have there are some logistical components that in a country as small as South Korea, where I think policing is a national function anyway, I think you're you don't have that in the United States. You do. I think realistically, you're recruiting state authorities to do a lot of the enforcement. So it's a more complicated proposition to get it working in the United States. But I think the basic idea that the government, in the circumstances of like this, that the national government is A, considered the responsible actor for a bunch of things, and B, has the authorities to do it, is pretty commonsensical.
I mean, I would actually disagree. I was just heralding today to a friend on the phone that like this entire thing, like this entire pandemic has been a triumph of local and state governments that are basically stepping in and serving people in like really conscripted ways that are super helpful to the scale at which like the various areas and municipalities and like locations that people are affected by the disease, and that the federal government has fallen down all over itself. And so like I kind of think that like going forward after watching that, the reactionary kind of if I was going to do like give proactive rights to anyone, that was kind of what I was saying, but I was saying it poorly. If I was going to give proactive rights to anyone, that like I think that the proactive rights should be in like in the states to like kind of control something like this. Does that make sense, Alan?
Well, yeah, and so I mean, I totally agree with you, right? That this pandemic shows why some degree of federalism, and specifically redundancy, not federalism in the states are allowed to, states can do things the feds can't, but rather if the feds fail at something, the states can also do that thing. That's really, really important. But so I'm in Minnesota, right? To the west of me are the Dakotas, neither of which I believe are in lockdown. This is like as of like 40
But there
hours.
are no people in either.
There are literally no people in the Dakotas. I mean, there are some.
There are some. Sioux Falls is happening in place. There's Iowa, which is not in lockdown, and there are people in Iowa. And then there's Wisconsin, which is both in lockdown and having a primary,
an election. Yeah.
Right? So I'm perhaps a little less sanguine about letting the states kind of just do this. I guess my bigger point is like, I don't know how much this is going to cost, but this is like, in addition to the thousands and thousands of tens of thousands of people this is going to kill, this is going to cost some like insane numbers of trillions of dollars, right? How could this not result in, and when you look at American history, right, American government expands basically in response to giant catastrophes, right? How could this not result in the largest, like one of the largest expansions of the surveillance state in American history, right? Whether you like it or not, or anything like that, it's just
I feel like in a different vector,
like a titanic historical force here. But
it's in a biovector, whereas like before it was in like some type of security, like it was now it's a biosecurity vector, whereas before it was like a physical security vector or something, whatever that means. But like, yes, I agree. We are out of time. We are a little bit overboard. Alan, this was so lovely. Thank you for bringing yourself and your rum cocktail to our show. This was very fun, even though we are here in lieu of fun. And we will be back tomorrow with, I think we still don't know what our guest is going to be tomorrow. We have like Friday and next Monday planned, but until then.
Does Hannah want to join us tomorrow?
What?
You should ask her.
Who?
Hannah.
Oh, Hannah. Yeah, totally. That would be great.
Yeah,
I would love that. I also am dying to get on someone that I met a couple months ago, Jason Furman at the Kennedy School. I don't know if he'd come on. He's not a close friend. He's just like an acquaintance, but like I'm like, I think he's brilliant. And like, he has had like a lot of really, really smart things to say about stimulus checks and everything that's going to be happening. And so that would be like I think maybe we should make tomorrow a little bit of a economist show. If we can.
All right. I just want to say, you guys are becoming, if not YouTube famous, then you are Zoom famous. And that is the new currency in our lockdown.
Famous?
It's our This is what this is Zoom famous right here.
We will
take it.
Be back tomorrow for the pre-Seder edition.
When is Seder, Ben? So I can remember. Thursday, Friday?
It's Wednesday.
No, it's Wednesday, Thursday.
Wednesday.
Okay.
And so
Is
We
it
will-
always a Wednesday, Thursday?
No,
No.
it's
Okay.
It's like a lunar
calendar,
thing.
you know, mysterious Hebrew calendar.
It's like a
Alan, I'm not
werewolf
Jewish.
thing.
Give me a break.
Yeah.
You're a law
All right.
professor in New York City. Okay, bye guys.
Talk to you later.